catching fish and birds in the winding, swampy Duwamish estuary, occupying an old army fort in a fight over land and rights, working in sawmills, canneries, and hops fields, buying back your own land to build a longhouse and community center, welcoming, rejecting, accommodating, resisting, adapting, and living. This is the Indigenous face of Seattle. Join me on a tour as we explore the Indigenous history of the Emerald City. Welcome to Indigenous History Now, the channel where we explore the histories, cultures, and languages of the Indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, primarily focusing on the lands that would become the United States. This video is part of Project Homecoming 2, a collaboration between myself and other historian friends of mine sharing the histories of the places that we live. When you're done here, go check out the rest of the playlist. There's a lot of great stuff. If you want to learn about another famous PNW city, you can join me and watch UsefulCharts' video on the history of Vancouver, Canada. Alright, that out of the way, on to the video. The history of human habitation in the area that would become Seattle goes back at least 10,000 years, and Salishan-speaking peoples have lived in the area for the past 6,000. The Duwamish are the Salishan group who have lived here as long as records can tell. And according to Duwamish legend, the history of this place begins here, at North Wind's Weir, along the Duwamish River, right around the modern-day boundary between the cities of Tukwila and Seattle. This site is the scene of the confrontation between Northwind and Stormwind in the epic creation story of the Duwamish people. The TLDR version of the story goes like this. Northwind was a hard and oppressive figure. He covered all the land in ice and snow, and on rocks which you could see behind me if the tide was lower, he had built a weir of fish that blocked all the salmon from going upstream. The people who lived upstream struggled and starved under these conditions. One of those people was Mountain Beaver Woman, Northwind's own daughter. She had married a man named Chinookwind, whom Northwind killed along with his whole tribe. After her husband's death, Mountain Beaver Woman gave birth to a son by Chinookwind named Stormwind. Stormwind eventually grew up and learned of his parentage and the atrocities that Northwind committed. Stormwind and Northwind faced off, and Stormwind was victorious. He warmed all the land, melting all the ice and snow, and destroyed Northwind's weir, leaving only the rocks which are visible at low tide. Thus, Northwind was driven away, the land made habitable, and the people flourished. It's interesting to note that modern estimates place the approximate southern boundary of Ice Age glaciers at about the southern Seattle area. It's possible that this story between Northwind and Stormwind is a very old story, preserving some knowledge of landscape conditions around here 15,000 years ago. Now, Seattle is a very different place than it was 15,000 years ago, but it's also very different than what it was just 200 years ago. Before the large-scale engineering projects of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Seattle was a much more wild place. Throughout the modern city limits, there were marshes, eelgrass patches, dense forests, clean water, a winding river, and a large estuary. Large swaths of modern downtown and the industrial district stand atop fill of what used to be a tidal mudflat. All of this habitat supported a rich diversity of plant and animal life, which in turn supported a healthy human population. Ducks and other waterfowl used to fly around the bends and curves of the Duwamish, where they would be caught in huge standing bird nets. Millions of migrating salmon made their annual trek up the river, where they were harvested via a series of weirs. The mudflats hosted oyster and clam beds, and the forests teemed with deer. The landscape was also a deeply spiritual one. A waterfront bluff off the Cedar Park neighborhood, several of the curves of the Duwamish, a stream on the east end of Salmon Bay, Alki Point. All of these and many more were places where either spirit beings once resided or people would quest for spirit power. The spirit world in Coast Salish cosmology is a very close and at-hand place, and one that is expressed in the landscape itself. You can watch my Northwest Coast overview videos linked in the description for more information on the pre-contact Duwamish world. If you come to Seattle today by any of the several available ferry routes, they'll all land you here, at Coleman Dock, right at the foot of Yesler Way. Now, before the dock was ever built and before Henry Yesler was ever born, this location went by a different name. It was the site of a Duwamish town known as Cecile. The name roughly translates to Little Crossing Over Place. It's in reference to the fact that the town stood on the western end of a trail that traversed the narrowest point of the Seattle Isthmus between the Puget Sound and Lake Washington. Well, the narrowest point at low tide, that is. Where I'm standing now used to be a peninsula, with a lagoon a couple blocks to my right and a large tidal mudflat beginning a couple blocks to the south. Thus, there were narrower areas, but they could only be reached at high tide and now no longer exist. Of course, these bodies of water also went by different names in the region's indigenous language of Lushootseed. The Duwamish and other Lushootseed-speaking tribes refer to the Puget Sound as Chulch, meaning salt water, and Lake Washington as Chacho, meaning lake. These being, respectively, the largest bodies of salt water and fresh water in the Lushootseed-speaking world, nobody was confused by referring to them simply as the salt water and the lake. Now, the town of Cecile was not the only Duwamish settlement in what would become Seattle. In fact, there were no fewer than 10 different towns throughout the modern city limits, with names like Slotwish, Little Canoe Channel, Puck-Atsashchu, Brush Spread on the Water, and Duhquitlud, Place of the Fish Spear. I use the word town because these weren't small, transient villages. They were all permanently occupied sites consisting of several large wooden longhouses, with populations ranging anywhere from several dozen to a couple hundred. These were centers of resource gathering and distribution, political and kinship networks, spiritual life, trade, diplomacy, and so on. Their streets bustled with life and activity of all sorts. Artwork, canoe and totem pole carving, gambling and games, dances and ceremonies, births, marriages, funerals, etc. Again, you can learn more about pre-contact life in my Northwest Coast Culture video. In their own language, the Duwamish call themselves the Duwamish, meaning people of the interior. The name references the fact that, unlike many other Lushootseed-speaking tribes whose principal settlements were along the shorelines of the Sound, most Duwamish lived a bit inland, either along the Duwamish River and its upstream tributaries, namely the Black, White, and Cedar Rivers, or along the shores of the lakes and protected bays of Seattle, namely Salmon Bay and Lake Washington. The modern Duwamish are actually composed of what used to be three closely related groups, though each with distinct names. The name Duwamish referred chiefly to the people who settled in the Duwamish Valley along the riverways. Then there were the Chacho-Absh, the lake people. This was the name used by those whose settlements ringed the shores of Lake Washington. The third and smallest group called themselves the Shulshulabsh, the people of tucked away inside. They lived in what is now the Ballard, Green Lake, Interbay neighborhoods, and their name derives from their sole principal settlement called Shulshul that stood on the west end of what is today Salmon Bay. Yes, that is the origin of the place name Shilshul. The shared experiences with white colonization over the last 150 years drew these three groups even closer together than they already were, resulting in the loss of the regional distinctions. Unfortunately, by the mid-19th century, diseases introduced since the start of the fur trade had already taken their toll on the local population. Some towns, including Cecile, had been entirely abandoned, but the place name was not forgotten. When the white colonists first arrived in 1851 to establish a city, they wound up making two. They first set up shop across the bay at Alki Beach. Don't worry, we'll visit there in a second. They quickly found that location inadequate, however, and the following spring in 1852 came over here and chose the site of the former Cecile as the permanent location for their city. Thus, most Duwamish applied the old name to the whites' settlement. Thus, to this day in Lushootseed, the modern city of Seattle is still referred to as Cecile. I'm standing now on Alki Beach in West Seattle, known by the Duwamish as Spaquabox, or Prairie Point. This is where, on November 13, 1851, Arthur Denny and 23 other colonists originally came ashore to establish an Anglo city in what would become Seattle. Through numerous retellings and frequent reenactments, this event has gained legendary status as a sort of origin myth for the city. To hear some people tell it, that day was nothing less than the fulfillment of American destiny. From the settlement of Jamestown and Plymouth to civilization's indomitable march across the plain, everything culminated here in the establishment of the imperial city of the Pacific. Predictably, the Duwamish are portrayed as playing only a minor part in the tale, if even mentioned at all. Now, this story tells us more about how white Seattleites saw themselves than anything about the actual event. If we take a step back and look at it from an Indigenous perspective, we can place it in its proper historical context. To start, the Denny Party were not the first white people to have traversed through the Puget Sound region. The fur trade had been alive and well since the 1790s. The Hudson's Bay Company had been operating Fort Nisqually 50 miles to the south since 1832. Nor were they the first colonists to establish a city in the region. On the southern tip of Puget Sound, Olympia had been established 5 years earlier in 1846. Nor were they even the first colonists to arrive in Seattle. They were beaten by a month by a separate party of 4 who had spent the meantime living in a Duwamish town, of 700 inhabitants, I might add. Nor was this the party's originally intended destination. They had departed from Illinois and taken the overland route to Portland, originally meaning to settle in Oregon's Willamette Valley. But upon arrival, they were told in Portland, here I am paraphrasing, "Oregon be full, go north." Thus they headed for Puget Sound. Upon arrival, the foreigners were greeted by a large party of Duwamish. Not because the Duwamish were unfamiliar with and surprised by the whites, but because they were very familiar with them and had expected them. The welcome committee was headed by someone who has been even more mythologized than these first white colonists, Chief Cecile. Cecile was a man of mixed Duwamish and Suquamish heritage. The Suquamish lived just across the Sound on the Kitsap Peninsula side of the water. Cecile was already a respected and accomplished Duwamish leader in his 70s by the time Denny's party arrived. He had been a lauded warrior and equally capable peacetime manager, and by all accounts, even in his old age, he was a very physically fit and imposing figure, over 6 feet in height with broad shoulders, a booming voice, and a gift for oratory. As a brief side note, it's quite possible that the speech Cecile is most well known and famous for today was not actually spoken by him. Undeniably, Cecile was a famous orator among both natives and non-natives, and he did speak at the Point Elliott Treaty Convention. It's just that what we all know as the Chief Seattle speech didn't first appear in print until 10 years after his death and contains imagery about the loss of the bison, which would have been entirely irrelevant to him and his people and wasn't really even happening yet when he supposedly gave the speech. Anyway, back to the video. Cecile also knew when a good deal was looking him in the face. As mentioned, fur traders had already been carrying on operations in the Sound region for a matter of decades, making wealthy men of both newcomer and native. Tribes with proximity to trading outposts had easy access to goods like blankets, firearms, metal tools and utensils, etc., which both served practical purposes and helped grease the wheels of the wealth-driven social institutions of the Northwest Coast. The fur trading era, which ran from about the 1790s to 1840s, was a golden age of potlatching, totem pole carving, and art, as more wealth than ever before flowed through Northwest communities. Again, go watch the other video. Thus, Indigenous leaders throughout the region were eager to welcome white settlers on favorable terms, and Cecile was no exception. The Duwamish helped clear land for the Denny Party's settlement, helped build their homes, and supported them with food. Within weeks of the landing, more Duwamish had moved into the new settlement than whites, eager for trade, better protection against raids from Canadian tribes, or just plain because it was a hot new thing. Rather than barely present peripheral actors, the Duwamish were instrumental in the inception of both this first settlement and the later Seattle. The whites named their settlement here on Spockwabox New York Alki. Alki is a word from Chinook jargon, the old lingua franca of the Northwest, that means something along the lines of by and by or after a while. Thus, the name meant something like New York on the by and by. At the time, New York was by far the largest and most culturally significant city of the United States, and it was a very real symbol of white American progress and expansionism. Manifest destiny in the flesh, so to speak. Thus, by choosing this name, Denny's party was very clearly communicating their aspirations for their new settlement. They wanted it to become the New York of the West Coast. However, this vision is not what the future had in store for New York Alki. It was windy, like today, didn't have a good natural harbor, and the nearest trees were atop those steep bluffs to my left. After its first winter, it was abandoned, and its white residents moved across the bay to Tzidzalal'ich. There they established a new city, and named it in honor of the man who had done so much to accommodate them, Chief Seattle. The aspirations for growth and expansion, however, remained as alive as ever. Despite dreaming visions of empire in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle's early white populace had to contend with one simple fact. There weren't enough of them. Their visions of growth and expansion would have been completely stillborn and Seattle relegated to the long list of failed colonial experiments were it not for Indigenous help. This help came first from the Duwamish, but as the city grew, it attracted people from other local tribes as well. Just as they had with the Alki settlement, Duwamish assisted with land clearing and home construction in the new Seattle. Importing food from other white colonies was prohibitively expensive, and considering it was on a peninsula surrounded by salt water, the budding Seattle didn't exactly have the best farming land. So white Seattleites bought their food from Duwamish, who provided fish and game as well as cultivated crops brought in from better suited areas. Sawmills formed the backbone of Seattle's industry for the first couple decades, staffed almost entirely by Indigenous laborers. They even used Indigenous-sourced dogfish oil as the primary lubricant on their equipment until the 1890s. Some parts of town could only be reached via canoe in an Indigenous ferry service. The U.S. mail was brought ashore in Indigenous canoes, and Indigenous women maintained the houses of Seattle's elite. For Indigenous people, there was much to gain from embracing relations with these foreigners. As already mentioned, employment and trade meant easy access to foreign manufactured goods. Some of these imports served practical purposes, but many were attractive because their novelty served as a status symbol. It's for precisely this reason that parasols and hoop skirts were all the rage amongst Indigenous women for a few years. Status recognized status, so Indigenous elites could often be seen hobnobbing with Seattle's white elite as a bolster to their own prestige. Some Indigenous people willingly converted to Christianity to see what sort of spiritual power this new Jesus guy could bring them. And of course, Indigenous people living and working in the city meant Indigenous cultures could be seen throughout the city. Seattle played host to potlatches and other ceremonies, salmon dried on racks in the streets, dugout cedar canoes lined the waterfront, Indigenous people chastised colonists for breaking taboos, etc. A sort of middle ground developed in the new city where white and Indigenous commingled together in a mixed space, adapting elements of the other's culture for their own use. Non-Indigenous newcomers often had to learn Chinook jargon as a near necessity to navigate life in what was supposed to be a white-dominated settlement, and many even learned Lushootseed. Here's a quote from Coll Thrush's book Native Seattle demonstrating the extent of this middle ground. Sometime in the 1870s, a Chinese man named Ling Fu was brought before Judge Cornelius Hanford in Seattle's courthouse for not having the proper citizenship papers. Facing deportation, Ling Fu argued that he did not need to carry papers. He had been born on Puget Sound. To test him, Judge Hanford quickly shifted his inquiry into Chinook jargon. Ikta mikinem, konsi kole mika. What is your name? How old are you? He demanded of Ling, who in turn replied, Nika nem Ling Fu, pe nika mox tatlam pi queenam kol. My name is Ling Fu, and I am 25 years old. Clearly surprised, the judge responded, You are an American, sure, and you can stay here. He then turned to the bailiff and decreed, Ling Fu is dismissed. Not only was culture shared, but owing to the scarcity of marriageable white women, many colonists of all classes took Indigenous wives or companions and fathered mixed children. Having been an Indigenous place forever before the whites came, for at least the first few decades, Seattle was still a thoroughly Indigenous place. Now, the existence of this middle ground of cooperation and accommodation, and Seattle's reliance on it, did not prevent or resolve all tensions. After all, this was still 1850s white supremacist America. Some of the early colonists were open to a mixed society. However, the majority of the population was still very racist and wanted to build a segregated one. Allow me a second to paint the scene. I'm back now on Yesler Way, which used to be known as Mill Street. Now, the terrain to the south was significantly transformed in the early 20th century. King Street is 4 blocks behind me, and everything south of there, west of I-5, down to about the West Seattle Bridge, used to be a tidal mudflat. Between King and Mill, what used to be a waterfront, the ground was flat, and north of Mill, it began to rise. Along the waterfront here is where the city's poor and working class lived. The city's elite inhabited the dry, neatly kept hills north of Mill. Thus, there was a very visible class divide in early Seattle between the dirty poors south of Mill, the literal downtown, and the prim and proper wealthy elite north and uptown of Mill. This class divide has driven much of the city's internal conflict throughout its early history, even up to the present day. Along the waterfront here is also where all the saloons, gambling houses, and brothels were set up. A district of sin and vice which came to derogatorily be known as the lava beds. Much of Seattle's indigenous population also lived in this waterfront neighborhoods, and the brothels were staffed almost exclusively by indigenous women. The city's middle ground, with all of its concomitant interaction with Duwamish and other local natives, caused a moral panic amongst the white upper class. Indigenous people and their cultures were seen as inherently morally corrupt and corrupting. It was feared that any accommodation with indigeneity within the new city would degrade the purity of white culture and the white soul. And the lava beds served as the perfect example of this. The emergence of the hives of scum and villainy that were the saloons, brothels, and gambling houses was seen as the consequence of the moral rot that resulted from too much interaction with the dirty Indians. The poor white residents of the lava beds were framed by some as hapless victims of the temptations of the Indian flesh who then blew all their money on booze, cards, and Indian women, and were thus reduced to their state of poverty by the moral corruption wrought from the race mixing. There was a very real fear that if Seattle didn't deal with its Indian problem, the moral rot would spread, and the whole city would thus be dragged down and destroyed. Seattle's Indigenous population was also stereotyped as being disease-ridden and a fire threat. Both of these prejudices had an insidious cruelty to them. First, it was Indigenous people who were dying of diseases introduced by the whites, not the other way around, and of the two major fires to strike the city throughout its history, the 1879 fire was started in a middle-class hotel, and the 1889 Great Fire was started in a cabinet-maker's shop, both started by whites. Yet, Indigenous and lower-class victims in general of both blazes were largely left to fend for themselves, while the city focused its efforts on rebuilding the damage done to the upper class and business districts. There were also numerous cases of arson that targeted Indigenous neighborhoods, but we'll talk about those in a bit. As the city leaders saw it, the solution to this Indian problem was segregation. Seattle was officially incorporated as a city in 1856, and one of its first city ordinances barred all Indigenous persons from residing within the city limits. In a perfect demonstration of Seattle's problem with not liking Indigenous people, but relying on Indigenous labor, the law carved out a specific exception allowing Indigenous employees of white businesses to be housed by their employers. The 1850s and 60s also saw the enactment of territory-wide anti-miscegenation laws that outlawed all interracial marriages in Washington and barred the mixed children of white fathers from inheritance. However, we still have records of marriages being performed even while these laws were in effect. It seems not everyone was so morally incensed. The moral panic was a bit more of an upper-class problem. After all, somebody had to be keeping the brothels in business. But there was something that whites of all background and social positions wanted: land. And they all agreed that the first step to get that land was to get rid of its current inhabitants. Thus, from late 1854 to early 1856, Governor Isaac Stevens went on a tour of the Washington Territory and brokered several treaties with Washington tribes. The goal, which was only partially accomplished, was to extinguish the Indigenous title to all the land in Washington and confine its Indigenous inhabitants to reservations. Seattle's land was covered by the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, along with all the land between the Cascades and the Sound from north of Mount Rainier to the Canadian border. Many natives found the provisions of their treaties severely objectionable and made their concerns known in the negotiations. Stevens allowed some compromises, but not nearly enough, and this American recalcitrance led tribes and their leaders across Washington Territory to break out in open warfare. The war, though spread across large swaths of the territory and fought over similar grievances, was not centrally coordinated and was experienced more as a collection of local conflicts. Thus, it's known by several regional names: the Yakima and Palouse Wars in eastern Washington, and the Puget Sound War or Chief Leschi's War here in western Washington. One engagement of this Puget Sound War was the January 26, 1856 Battle of Seattle. Seattleites had expected an attack since the outbreak of hostilities in October, and attacks on outlying homesteads south of town only solidified this belief. Thus, the Navy sloop USS Decatur had been stationed in Elliott Bay, and townsfolk had built a blockhouse and other defenses with the help of Marines from the Decatur. The blockhouse was built about 3 blocks that way, underneath what is now a parking lot on the corner of First and Cherry. I'm currently standing in City Hall Park next to a monument to the battle installed in 1916 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, not all local natives wanted war. Siash counseled his people against it, and another chief known to the colonists as Curly Jim warned his white neighbors that an attack was imminent in the early morning hours of January 26th. This heads-up gave Seattle's 50-some white residents time to escape to the blockhouse and man the defenses. Sympathetic Indigenous warriors also fought alongside their white neighbors in defense of the city. If not for this help from Indigenous people, the battle may well have ended very differently. As it stood, only 3 colonists died, and 2 of those from friendly fire, and the attackers retreated around 10 p.m. The war ended here in the West in March of 1856 after only a winter's worth of fighting. This theater's principal chief, Leshai in his native Lushootseed, was captured later that November. In what is seen widely now, and even amongst some then, as a sham trial, he was charged and convicted of murder of a white soldier and hanged in 1858. The war did bring the U.S. government to modify some treaty terms, and the Puyallup and Nisqually both got better reservations out of it. A new reservation, Muckleshoot, was also established for people from multiple tribes living in the upstream areas of the White and Green Rivers. The Nisqually and Puyallup's successes in modifying their reservations unfortunately would not be repeated by the Duwamish. The 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott did not grant the Duwamish a reservation in their home territory of Seattle. Instead, it required them to move either across the Sound to the Suquamish Reservation or north to the Tulalip Reservation. When the Muckleshoot Reservation was established to the south in 1857, it added another possible destination to the list. Even after many Duwamish defended Seattle against other Indigenous people during the war, the government and their white neighbors would still not make a reservation in the Seattle area itself. Many Duwamish would eventually make the moves to the out-of-town reservations. Some moved away only to return owing to poor conditions and lack of food on their assigned reservations. Understandably, many Duwamish wanted to stay in their homes and never left. Considering how reliant Seattle was on Indigenous labor, it's a good thing too that many Duwamish stayed. The Duwamish residents who kept the city alive worked to petition the U.S. government for a reservation within their homelands. The effort was even supported by local Indian agent Thomas Page. After years of cajoling, the federal government finally relented, and in 1866 promised the Duwamish a reservation right here on the north shore of the Black River in what is today the Bryn Mawr Skyway neighborhood on the southern end of Lake Washington. As you can probably guess, that reservation never materialized. When white Seattleites heard of this nefarious scheme to let the Duwamish stay in their homes, they were not pleased, and they petitioned their congressional delegate Arthur Denny, yes, that Arthur Denny, to kill the deal. The petition was signed by practically every white man then living in King County, including all the leading figures of Seattle's founding. David Denny, Doc Maynard, Henry Yesler, Arthur Denny himself, yes, he signed a petition addressed to himself, etc. Now, here's an important thing to note. At the time, there were at best a handful of white families living anywhere in the Black River neighborhood, and none within the proposed boundaries of the reservation. This area would not be significantly colonized for another 10 years. However, it had been known since 1853 that there were coal deposits along the Black River. Now, mining would not start significantly for another decade either, but white Seattleites knew the coal was here. The colonizers' issue with the reservation was not that it would displace any currently settled white folk. It was that it would prevent them from taking and mining this land at some undetermined point in time in the future. For the growth-obsessed, manifest destiny-minded, and let's be honest, greedy colonizers, telling them even a sliver of land was off-limits was simply unacceptable. Thus, for the sake of future growth and progress, and giving white folk what they wanted, the deal was shelved, and the Duwamish denied their reservation. Still to this day, in 2023, 160 years later, the Duwamish do not have a reservation. 1883 saw the beginning of a dramatic shift in Seattle. That year, the railroad connected the city overland to the rest of the United States, bringing in massive numbers of new colonists. Seattle entered a period of exponential growth in its non-Indigenous population over the next 4 decades, from around 4,000 in 1880 to 80,000 in 1900, and from there to 300,000 in 1920. The arrival of all these new colonizers sparked a change in Seattle's disposition towards its Indigenous population. Gone were the days of the mixed-race middle ground. Now there were finally enough white colonizers and marriageable white women that it was no longer needed. The city could finally live up to its segregationist aspirations and push its Indigenous residents to the margins of society. Outright hostility towards the Duwamish and other Indigenous locals exploded, as the colonizers aggressively pushed them out and ate up their lands. Here I'm sitting at Tualaut Village Park, on the western shore of the Duwamish River's mouth. This park is named after the Duwamish town of Duwamish, or Herring's House, that once stretched from here a couple blocks up that way, around the corner of 17th and Marginal, south of the West Seattle Bridge. Side note, if you look on a map, you'll see a Herring's House park a couple blocks south of here. That is not the site of Herring's House. That is the site of a different Duwamish town, Yaliquad, or Basketry Hat. The actual Duwamish here was the last Duwamish town within the city limits of Seattle. In 1893, a gang of whites burned it to the ground. What was exceptional about this wasn't actually that it happened, but that it was reported on. The incident made its way into the local papers and was the only instance of white arson against Duwamish in Seattle to be reported on when it happened. However, as I mentioned before, Duwamish longhouses once stood all around the city. Over the years, numerous Duwamish elders would report that many of them were burned down by the colonizers. Predictably, city officials did little to stem this white violence, largely because they themselves were engaged in displacing the Duwamish. If it wasn't active arson, it was eviction by eminent domain, usually without proper compensation, to make way for new developments. Filling in mudflats and beaches, straightening the Duwamish River, leveling steep hills, creating artificial islands, rerouting streams, late 19th, early 20th century Seattle bore witness to an orgy of engineering projects and general urban sprawl. These projects frequently displaced Duwamish residents whose homes were in the path of progress. Duwamish were increasingly driven to leave or become houseless in their own home. All the development and its resulting pollution also destroyed much of the natural ecosystem of Seattle as well as important spiritual sites. The marshes, the eelgrass, the tide flats and estuary, all of that was now being ground under the wheels of development and destiny. Clam beds were no more, salmon populations were plummeting, and there was no game to be had anywhere. Eventually, the impacts of this destruction were recognized and conservation efforts began. However, rather than curbing the overconsumption and overdevelopment of the whites that was causing the degradation, the conservation laws usually scapegoated Indigenous people, criminalizing their traditional subsistence strategies. Both the destruction from development and the harassment from the conservation laws diminished Duwamish abilities to support themselves outside of the wage economy. This also contributed to homelessness if they couldn't find a job. The Lake Washington Ship Canal was a particularly disastrous project, as it not only displaced the last residents of the old town of Shulshul and converted Salmon Bay from a tidal inlet into a freshwater body, but in 1916 it lowered the level of Lake Washington by around 10 feet. This was enough to prevent the flow of water through the Black River on the lake's southern shore, which then dried up. The Black River has always been an important river for Duwamish. If you'll recall, the hills just north of the river's mouth was the proposed location of the 1866 reservation. And in the early 20th century, before it was destroyed, the Black River was still home to one of the last communities of Duwamish in their homelands. Fortunately, despite their best efforts, the colonizers could not drive the Duwamish out entirely. To this day, there has always been a Duwamish population in Seattle. There has never been a time when there were no Duwamish left in the city. However, by the early 20th century, that population was dwindling. Bit by bit, Seattle's indigenous landscapes were being transformed, and many of the Duwamish forced to leave the city and find opportunities elsewhere. They moved in all directions, north to the Tulalip, south to the Muckleshoot, east to Snoqualmie, and west to Suquamish. Yet, even as the Duwamish found it difficult to live in their own home, for other indigenous Northwesterners, Seattle was still a land of opportunity. If you know anything about Seattle's real estate market, you'll know that I am not in Seattle anymore. I'm standing next to a little farm in Fife on the Puyallup Reservation about 25 miles south of town. Farms like this in western Washington are increasingly rare these days, especially here along the I-5 corridor. In fact, actually that construction right behind me wasn't here the last time I was. Most of Washington's agricultural production today comes from the eastern side of the state. But in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, this was not the case. All throughout the Puget Sound region, the South Sound, the Snohomish and Skagit valleys, basically wherever there's flat land, there were farms like this, growing vegetables, herbs, flowers, and the big one, hops. Washington is the leading producer of hops in the United States by far, growing around 70% of the nation's crop, and one of the leading hops producers in the world. And this Washington hops industry, which grossed around $430 million in 2022, began 100 years ago in Puget Sound farms like this, picked by Indigenous farmhands. So how does this connect with the story of Seattle? I'm currently standing on Puyallup land. You might expect that this farm would have been picked by Puyallup hands and maybe some Duwamish. In reality, Puget Sound farms of the late 19th, early 20th century were picked by Indigenous farmhands from up and down the northwest coast. Local Coast Salish, yes, but also Makah, Nuchanoth, Heiltsuk, Niska'a, and even Eyak and Tlingit from Alaska. And all of these laborers made their way to the fields via Seattle. Seattle has always been a site of international travel and trade. Archaeologists have unearthed trade goods from northern British Columbia going back 3,000 years, and the potlatch tradition of the northwest coast would have seen Seattle's Duwamish regularly host guests and dignitaries from tribes all over the region. Not to mention the semi-regular slave raids from northern tribes such as the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw that continued even after white colonists arrived. Non-Duwamish Indigenous Americans have been traveling through Seattle for as long as memory gives us insight. The fur trade brought Hawaiian sailors through the Puget Sound, and later projects such as the railroads brought Chinese laborers, like Ling Fu mentioned earlier. Indigenous farmhands came through the city as a new wave of job seekers which began in earnest in the 1870s. Indigenous Northwesterners had long been accustomed to patterns of seasonal migration between permanent town sites and seasonal hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds. Again, go watch the other video. Thus, they merely adjusted this age-old practice and began seasonal excursions to the Puget Sound's new agricultural lands as farmhands. Along the way, they would stop over in Seattle, where they would spend their wages on goods to bring back home. These goods could be supplies for practical use or daily convenience, like flour, coffee, clothes, or utensils, or wealth-flaunting prestige items and potlatch gifts. One account attests to a household with a half-dozen phonographs and sewing machines that their owners just displayed and never used. The economic opportunities available in Seattle and its Puget Sound hinterland were such that whole families would make the trip, nearly emptying out entire home reservations for months at a time. These migrations helped to curb government assimilation and civilizing efforts, as well as some of the worst abuses of the reservation system. Indian agents in both the US and Canada were powerless to prevent their charges from leaving the reservations for work, and thus it was much harder for them to exert the sort of abusive control that Indian agents in other parts of both countries could wield. For Canadian tribes, these migrations into the U.S. allowed them the opportunity to continue potlatching on U.S. soil after the institution was banned in Canada in 1885. I'm not saying that life was easy, or that cultural erasure had no impact on Northwest Indigenous communities. As with Indigenous peoples across the continent, the late 19th, early 20th centuries was a very dark time, and the boarding schools still loomed large. Just that, Northwest tribes has certain opportunities to resist, and they took them. Almost paradoxically, as they were working to push living Indigenous people to the city's margins, Seattle's whites were adopting Indigenous art and iconography as symbols of the city. However, as we're about to explore, this wasn't quite the contradiction that it seems at first light. Sometime around the year 1790, a Tlingit noblewoman by the name of Chief of All Women drowned in the Nass River on the way to visit a sick relative. A mortuary pole was carved in her honor, erected outside her hometown on Tongass Island, and her remains buried inside its base. 100 years later, in 1899, a group of Seattle bankers, clergymen, and land speculators, aboard a ship chartered by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, came ashore to see the longhouses and totem poles of the town. They were particularly taken by the Chief of All Women pole, and so proceeded to saw it from its base, discard Chief of All Women's remains, and float it out to their ship, breaking off the raven carving's beak in the process. They sailed the stolen pole back to Seattle, whereupon they donated it to the city, who erected it here in Pioneer Square as Seattle's first public monument. Now, the pole behind me is not the original. It's a replica erected in 1940 after the original was damaged beyond repair by an arsonist 2 years prior. This episode, a stolen Indigenous Alaskan totem pole being used as a symbol of Seattle, bears witness to a larger trend of this city defining its image and identity through appropriation of Indigenous culture. This trend really kicked off in the late 19th century and continues to a certain extent to this very day. More so than any other city in the United States, Seattle has leaned into its Indigenous heritage to forge its civic identity. It's the largest American city named after an Indigenous person, has held several Indigenous-themed festivals or exhibitions over the years, and Northwest-style art can be seen through dozens of totem poles and other public art all around town. Now, this Indigenous visibility can be something of a point of pride amongst modern Seattleites. The city has gained quite a reputation as being a very progressive place since about the 1960s. But when this trend first started, it didn't have the same connotations that most people probably intend or interpret today. You see, these Indigenous images were not originally meant as monuments to honor Seattle's Indigenous past. They were trophies. Seattle around the year 1900 had firmly established itself as an imperial city. It was the largest city in the entire Pacific Northwest region, and remains so today, with one of the busiest shipping ports in the United States, also the case today. As such, it was the gateway for many people to the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and the entire Upper Pacific, a role that was pretty thoroughly demonstrated in the years of the Klondike Gold Rush, when Seattle was the city that tens of thousands of prospectors chose as their supply base for their trip to the Yukon. Seattle took on this mantle of being the Queen City of the Pacific. The manifest destiny dreams of progress and glory that had inspired the founders of New York Alki were alive and well. This period was also the high point of the vanishing Indian hysteria. America had fought its last Indian wars, had seemed to neatly confine all Indigenous people to reservations, and was engaged in projects of civilizing the savages. And disease, and the conditions wrought by colonialism, had wreaked havoc on Indigenous populations. It seemed to white people, who very much wanted to see it this way, that Indigenous Americans were a dying people, destined to, in very short order, either assimilate completely into white society, or physically all cease to exist. Thus, there was a sudden rush in interest in Indigenous cultures amongst large swaths of American society. Anthropologists, historians, and linguists wanted to document Indigenous cultures for posterity, and many in the general population wanted to revel in the exoticness of the picturesque and quaint pre-settler past, using a few Indigenous place names, reading literature, watching plays with Indigenous characters, and collecting Indigenous-made, or inspired, baskets, blankets, knives, art pieces, and general curios. And Seattle was no exception to this. In fact, Seattle was in a perfect position to capitalize on this trend. You see, the Pacific Northwest was seen as one of the last places with good examples of authentic Indian culture. Thus, there was a lot of attention, both by professional academics and by average Joes, on the peoples of this region. Seattle's position as the gateway to the Pacific also meant it was the gateway to Pacific Northwest culture. Americans wanting to get their hands on authentic Indian artifacts didn't have to go all the way to Alaska or the backwoods of British Columbia. They could make their way to Seattle, where many street corners were lined with Indigenous Northwesterners from all areas of the coast hawking their wares. Or they could stroll through any one of the city's multiple curio shops, whose goods were sometimes made by natives, either in their home communities or Seattle itself, and sometimes were native-inspired. Indigenous names for new urban subdivisions and Northwest-style public art helped highlight Seattle's Indigenous past and drive tourism. However, there was also another, more unsavory side of this cultural appropriation. We've observed quite a bit already how Seattle had always defined itself in the context of manifest destiny. The narrative that hardy white pioneers were foreordained to construct civilization out of the savagery of wilderness. A destiny as unavoidable as a force of nature. And the rightness of this narrative seemed to be confirmed by the early 20th century phenomenon of the vanishing Indian. The very real decline in Indigenous populations, power, and intergenerational cultural transmission was seen by many whites as the inevitable result of the unstoppable march of civilization and progress, and they reveled in the achievement. But of course, there was nothing inevitable or unstoppable about any of this. The suffering Indigenous Americans had to live through was the result of centuries of overtly genocidal policies on the part of the United States and other colonial powers who wanted to scrub them from existence. Manifest destiny is a historical philosophy that requires that Indigenous people be actively dispossessed of their land and replaced with white people. Without that, its inevitability remains unrealized. It's worth pointing out that the interest in Indigenous art, stories, place names, etc. emerged only after living Indigenous people were securely removed from, or at least pushed to the margins of, American society. Indigenous culture suddenly became attractive once Indigenous people were no longer in control of it and no longer took up space in American life. Aside from tourist trap curios, it was this final replacement of Indigenous Seattle by white Seattle that was being celebrated by the city's appropriation of Indigenous culture. A poem written after the erection of the Chief of All Women pole in Pioneer Square attests to the presence of these attitudes. I am the only civilized totem pole on Earth, and civilization suits me well. While all the others of my kind are slowly settling on their stems among the salmon-scented silences sequestered from the sight of man, here in Seattle's surging scenes I stand incomparable. So here's farewell to all my past, and welcome to the things that are. With you henceforth my die is cast, I've hitched my wagon to a star. And by the sacred frog that hops, and by the bird that flies, and by the whale and the bear, I sunder all the ties that bound me to the ancient creed which holds my people flat. And I will be a totem pole that knows where it is at. We can see in these lines there's no concept of uplifting or honoring the Indigenous origin of this totem pole. They're being actively denigrated as backwards, regressive, and doomed. Rather, the pole is being held up like a trophy of conquest. It's more a spoil of war than a monument to respected ancestors. Getting up on a soapbox for a sec, the vast majority of Indigenous sports mascots originate from this pre-civil rights time period as well. Is the use of Indigenous people as mascots an honor or a trophy? I digress. This mixture of tourist curio and imperialist gloating also came out in events the city has hosted over the years. There was the 1909 Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. This was a World's Fair celebrating Seattle's progress in modernity by highlighting exotic stereotypes about the Indigenous past and contrasting that image with Seattle's present. Northwest art was displayed all around. There were human zoo-style exhibits of Indigenous cultures, human scalps here and there, recreations of stagecoach attacks by Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which never happened anywhere near Seattle, and plenty of purchasable collectibles. These exhibits of the savage past were juxtaposed against the display of modern Indigenous school children brought down from the Tulalip Reservation School to show the progress that had been made in the work of civilizing the Indian. The message was very clear. Indigenous cultures were a thing of the past. The only place Indigenous people had in this new America and this new Seattle was through complete adoption of the white man's ways. Then there were the potlatches put on by the Tillicums of Eltias. Eltias is Seattle spelled backwards. The Tillicums were a fraternal organization/booster group of Seattle's wealthy elite that promoted urban expansion and tourism. They dressed up in parades and other public events as Northwest Indigenous chiefs and put on a series of Indigenous-themed festivals, which they dubbed potlatches, in the early 1910s and again in the 1930s. Now, the real institution of the potlatch in Northwest Coast societies is an engine of wealth redistribution whereby the poor are uplifted and provided for out of the wealth of the rich. Needless to say, this aspect of potlatch tradition was left out of the Tillicums events. So what did Indigenous people themselves think of all this appropriation? Much of the art for display and on sale around the city was made by Indigenous artists. Indigenous people themselves staffed the 1909 exposition. By about this time, white Seattleites were starting to lionize the memory of Chief Cecile and make yearly pilgrimages to his grave on the Duwamish Reservation, despite his death having gotten no attention in the press when it actually happened in 1866. So what did they think of all this? Well, first and foremost, it provided opportunities to make a living. Indigenous artisans benefited from all the public attention, and events like the 1909 exposition offered good-paying jobs no different than any other trip to Seattle. One Inupiaq man, Oliver Angeluk, left for home after just 2 days of caring for the exposition's reindeer. He'd made enough in those 2 days alone to leave Seattle and provide for his family in Alaska for several seasons. But there were plenty of other reasons for Indigenous people to engage in events like the Tillicums potlatches or the 1909 exposition, despite the arrogant pretensions of the organizers. For many, these were chances to openly exercise their cultures undisturbed by the watchful eyes of Indian agents back on the res. For Buffalo Bill's employees, they were opportunities to travel and see the country and even the world. The intermingling of people from different communities provided opportunities to strengthen intertribal bonds or resolve old enmities. And of course, Indigenous people were just as much visitors and spectators to these occasions as they were staff. Whatever racist and assimilationist messages the whites intended to communicate with these events, Indigenous people themselves could just ignore them and engage with the affairs on their own terms. Even in the hardest days of colonialist pressure, Indigenous people were carving out a space for themselves to live their own lives in Seattle. So do these imperialist origins of Seattle's use of Indigenous iconography mean the city today should stop publicly exploring its Indigenous past? Well, that's part of the conversation a lot of American towns and cities are having with their public art right now, isn't it? I don't think we need to imbue the same meaning onto something that our ancestors did. After all, public art reflects back on us the meanings that we assign to it. But I don't think it's enough to just declare that these monuments which resulted from appropriation now communicate appreciation just because we're not racist anymore. If Seattle wants to continue embracing its Indigenous culture as part of its identity, then its real, living Indigenous people need to be at the center of that effort. 2 world wars and a Great Depression brought profound change to Seattle. By the 1950s, it was no longer a logging and canning town, but a city of global significance with robust shipping and aerospace sectors. As had been the case for many decades, Indigenous people kept making their homes in the city, usually in firmly working-class neighborhoods. Change continued in the 50s, though taking on new forms. This was the era of the federal termination and relocation policies, another effort by Uncle Sam to crack up the last bastions of Indigenous land and get rid of those pesky Indian treaties once and for all. Termination was the government's effort to end federal recognition of select tribes. This would dissolve their reservations, end federal protection of their lands, and open up that land to sale to non-natives. Relocation aimed to disintegrate rural Indigenous communities and accomplish the final assimilation of Indigenous people into white America by busing res natives to cities around the country: Denver, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Phoenix, Seattle. Through the relocation program, the composition of Seattle's Indigenous population changed again. It was no longer representative of just the Northwest Coast, but the entire continent. Choctaw, Blackfoot, Lakota, Caddo, Apache, Muskogee, Aleut, and many others. The purpose of relocation was to help reservation natives integrate with urban white society. This would be done by providing them with transportation to a city of their choosing and rent until they could get on their feet and support themselves. This goal, however, did not happen. The bus ticket was paid for, the rent usually not past the first month. Rural natives were taken to the city and simply abandoned to their own devices. Indigenous city dwellers tended to find each other and make their own communities. White supremacy, after all, was still alive and well in the 50s, and as much as Uncle Sam wanted to integrate Indigenous people into white society, racist whites did not. This mix of discrimination and lack of support meant many in Seattle's Indigenous population overlapped with its homeless population. One of these Indigenous neighborhoods was Pioneer Square, right in the heart of downtown Seattle, better known then as Skid Row. Standing as it did basically atop the old lava beds, Skid Row of the 1950s was just as much the poor part of town as it had been in the 1850s. Many residents were homeless, many on the verge, housed only by the presence of the 1,700 SRO rooms, single resident occupancy, in local hotels that provided cheap accommodations. 30% of Skid Row's population were either Indigenous or Asian, reflecting an important relationship in the city's ethnic history, and all were poor. Despite the poverty and the homelessness, the poor health and the early deaths, the disdain of the middle and upper classes, and the general seedy reputation, to its residents, Skid Row was home. It was dysfunctional, for sure, but it was stable. It was a place with a sense of community. It had its own identity, it operated on its own terms, and people felt like they belonged. To quote from native Seattle, "Despite the long, dingy, and bitter-smelling corridors of the Morrison Hotel, for example, one young Indian woman said, 'I loved it here.'" One of the institutions that made Skid Row home were the Indigenous bars. For a long time, state law and city ordinances forbade the sale of alcohol to Indigenous peoples. Those laws were relaxed in the 1950s, allowing for a number of Indigenous-owned bars to open up along First Ave from Pioneer Square to Belltown: the Lotus, the Anchor, the Britannia, El Coco, and others. I'm actually standing in front of the site of the old Britannia here on the south side of First and Yesler. They were called bow and arrow joints and provided important venues of community both for the Indigenous residents of Skid Row and Indigenous people living in other parts of town. For instance, one Indigenous veteran who lived in a middle-class neighborhood often came here to the Britannia on his weekends because, quote, his people were here. Unfortunately for those who called Skid Row home, it was too much of a public eyesore to be left alone for long. At the same time, relocation and the Black Great Migration were bringing a bunch of new non-white residents into Seattle, white flight was taking much of the white population out to the suburbs. Almost as soon as this process started, the whites who remained began calling for urban renewal and began looking for ways to revitalize certain neighborhoods. The neighborhoods under scrutiny, of course, almost always were non-white neighborhoods, and urban renewal also goes by a different name: gentrification. Numerous proposals were put forth over the years to clean up downtown, but the one that got the attention of the business community was a 1966 proposal by John Graham and Company. The plan was to raise basically all of downtown save for 4 blocks around Pioneer Place Park. The rest would be leveled and replaced with skyscrapers, high-rise apartments, parking lots, and a highway. However, this vision ran afoul of a budding new constituency more interested in historic preservation and heritage tourism than rapacious development. They lobbied against the Graham plan, wanting to see the neighborhood instead preserved as a National Historic District. The preservationists got their way, and in 1970, the Pioneer Square Historic District was established, among the first in the nation. The preservationists may have saved the buildings of Skid Row, but their intentions for its residents were no more noble or humane than the developers. The downtown was meant to fuel tourism, after all, and we can't be scaring off the tourists with a bunch of poors. The city passed new preservation and safety ordinances, then proceeded to shut down dozens of SRO hotels, the best option for affordable housing in downtown. For years, pretty much the only option left was the Morrison Hotel right behind me. By the mid-1970s, around 75% of downtown Seattle's housing stock was gone, and Pioneer Square had lost 60% of its population. The bow and arrow joints all closed as their clientele dried up. By 1981, around 15,000 units of SRO housing had been eliminated, replaced by bookstores, coffee shops, and cafes, and art galleries catering to middle-class tourists. The Indigenous neighborhood of Skid Row had been destroyed, and the people who lived there were left more impoverished, more unemployed, and more homeless than before the neighborhood's revitalization. Oh, the tax bills and the profit margins being produced in this segment of town were up for sure, but that growth did nothing to help the people who called this neighborhood home. In fact, it actively came at their expense. Getting back up on my soapbox for a sec, and at the risk of pissing off half this town, maybe, just maybe, people can build prosperous lives when they have a stable community base to stand on. Maybe constantly sweeping out homeless encampments, denying struggling people a place to stay, and continually destroying the communities that homeless and near homeless people are trying to create, maybe that makes it less possible for them to improve their situation, not more. Just a thought. Being Indigenous in Seattle was a hard thing in the post-war years. Employment discrimination was rampant in both public and private sectors. Apartments would refuse to rent to Indigenous tenants. Banks would refuse Indigenous mortgages. Healthcare was substandard as hospitals would just straight up turn away Indigenous patients. And police brutality was about as common as their complete disinterest in investigating crimes against Indigenous people. Faced with all this, many Indigenous Seattleites tried to pass themselves off as Italian. The start of the civil rights movement did increase attention to inner-city issues and in finding solutions that weren't just gentrification, but most of that attention and the admittedly limited funds that followed it were directed at the city's Black community. No, if anybody was going to take care of Seattle's Indigenous community, it would have to be themselves, and that's exactly what they did. In 1958, Pearl Warren, her daughter Mary Jo Butterfield, and 5 other women began meeting in Pearl's house. They went around town recruiting other women, and by fall of that year had over 50 members in the newly constituted American Indian Women's Service League, Seattle's leading urban Indigenous organization for the next 20 years. They opened Seattle's first Indian Center in 1960, which quickly became a refuge for natives in the city. One Indigenous place. One place of warmth and friendship in a city that loved to ostracize Indigenous people. The Service League organized events like the annual Salmon Bake at Alki Point. They provided food, shelter, and clothing for those in need, helped orient new relocatees to the city, something the feds were supposed to be doing as part of the program, shared cultural knowledge, published a newsletter, and in general helped Indigenous people in the city connect with each other. They were also a politically active group. They spoke out against termination and relocation. Pearl Warren even testified before a Senate subcommittee against the policies in 1968. And they organized an international urban Indian conference in Seattle attended by activists and community organizers from across the US and Canada. They helped inspire a new generation of Indigenous activists, one that would take their action along a more direct path. On the chilly morning of March 8, 1970, around 100 Indigenous activists, including Bernie Whitebear, Ella Aquino, Ramona Bennett, and Robert Satayakam, stormed Fort Lawton, what is today Discovery Park. They took the fort from three sides, climbing over the razor wire-lined chain link of the front gate and the north fence, and up the 100-foot cliff from the south. They had no intentions of violence and carried no weapons. In fact, they hadn't expected to meet much resistance. Fort Lawton had been decommissioned as an active facility, and the federal government was trying to decide what to do with the surplus land. The activists who took over the fort had organized as the United Indians of All Tribes. Inspired by the ongoing occupation of Alcatraz Island by Red Power activists, they claimed the land by right of discovery. It was their intention to see it turned into a hub for Indigenous services in Seattle, a community center that could provide education, healthcare, poverty relief, and cultural programming in a more organized fashion and at a larger scale than was capable with the current crisis-driven Indian Center. They hadn't expected much resistance, but they got it. That weekend, a reserve company of military police was on duty, and within a few minutes after the fort was breached, around 40 military police descended on the activists with billy clubs and tear gas. The takeover turned into a brawl, and the activists were pushed out of the fort. They set up a camp outside the main gate named Resurrection City, where they stayed for the next 4 weeks, making several other takeover attempts. The incident made international news. Celebrities like Dick Gregory and Jane Fonda, whose names should be familiar if you've watched my Fish Wars video, came to lend their support. The occupation ended in April, but the wrangling over the fort's fate continued for another 2 years. Eventually, a deal was reached between the federal government, the City of Seattle, and the United Indians of All Tribes Foundation. The fort would be sold to Seattle for the creation of Discovery Park, and the foundation would lease 16 acres of the park for the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center. Opened in 1976, Daybreak Star is an important nexus of Seattle's Indigenous community today. It offers Head Start classes, foster care advocacy, culturally appropriate outpatient therapy, outpatient substance abuse treatment, GED courses, housing referrals, and hosts an art market and annual powwow. The UIATF and the Women's Service League are both still active today, but in the years since the occupation, they've been joined by a whole host of organizations serving Seattle's 12,000 Indigenous residents. There's the Seattle Indian Health Board, offering culturally sensitive modern healthcare as well as traditional medicine, the Chief Seattle Club, serving homeless natives, especially in downtown, Queer Oyate, providing HIV and AIDS treatment, and many more. Thanks to the tireless efforts of past Indigenous leaders and the ongoing work of their successors, being Indigenous in Seattle is not so difficult as it once was. Despite the gains made to re-indigenize Seattle and make it more hospitable to Native people, there is still much work to be done. Little demonstrates that better than what happened here at the intersection of Boren and Howell on August 30th, 2010. That day, an Indigenous elder named John T. Williams was crossing the street. He was an 8th-generation DT Dot carver who could often be seen carving at Victor Steinbrook Park just north of Pikes Place Market. That afternoon at 4:15 p.m., Williams crossed the street here, carrying a block of wood and his unopened carving knife. He passed in front of the patrol car of a Seattle police officer, Ian Burke. Burke got out of his car, sidearm drawn, and yelled at Williams to drop the knife, before shooting him 4 times, hitting him in the side and back. The incident was caught on Burke's dash cam. Burke began shooting 4.7 seconds after exiting his vehicle. Williams died soon after. Burke would later claim that Williams was coming towards him with the knife open in an aggressive manner, a claim that is refuted by the pattern of Williams' injuries and by multiple eyewitness accounts of the incident. Oh, and there's one more thing. John Williams was deaf. The murder of a deaf Indigenous elder sparked outrage in Seattle's Indigenous community, who, like Indigenous, Black, and Latino people all across the United States, are all too familiar with police brutality. Hundreds took to the streets in the following days calling for Burke's arrest. An internal SPD review of the incident found Burke's use of deadly force to be unjustified and premature, but he was not charged with any crime and was allowed to resign 6 months later. A decision that was seen widely as a miscarriage of justice and sparked a fresh round of protest. The murder and its ensuing controversy became a sort of catalyst. It galvanized a growing police accountability movement, which has been pretty strong in Seattle ever since. Williams's murder was by no means an isolated incident. It was merely one in a pattern of racism, poor judgment, and excessive force that had grown to attract the attention of even the Federal Department of Justice. The DOJ launched an investigation, and in 2012 concluded that the Seattle Police Department engaged in a, quote, pattern or practice of excessive force. They placed the SPD under a consent decree aimed at reforming its policies and policing culture that has only been lifted in March of 2023, though they are still under a compliance agreement, basically a pared-down version of a consent decree. Only time will tell if meaningful change has been achieved in Seattle's law enforcement culture. Editing me here. It was only the day after filming this that the news broke that a university student, John Avakandula, had been crossing the street and was hit and killed by a Seattle police officer going 74 into 25. What's more, dashcam footage caught the vice president of the Seattle Police Union joking and laughing about the incident, saying Kandula had, quote, limited value. It seems this department still has a lot more work to do. I've talked a lot about the Duwamish in this video, so it may surprise many of you to learn that, as far as Uncle Sam is concerned, the Duwamish are not Indigenous. Oh, to be sure, the government recognizes that a people called Duwamish once did exist, but as far as they're concerned, those people all either moved on to the Tulalip, Lummi, Snoqualmie, Muckleshoot, or Suquamish reservations, or ceased to exist. In the eyes of the federal government, the people who claim Duwamish lineage, who aren't affiliated with any of those tribes, are just regular old American citizens making up an Indigenous ancestry. You see, the Duwamish tribe that's based in Seattle today is not federally recognized. This means they get no access to federal programs or funds, no ability to put land into trust status, no recognition or ability to exercise protected treaty rights, and, as just described, no acknowledgement of Indigenous heritage. But it didn't used to be this way. Cecile Hansen, chair of the Duwamish tribe, enumerated the many ways that the government has acknowledged Duwamish tribal existence over the years. From 1860 to 1924, Congress passed almost 60 statutes denominating the Duwamish and other allied tribes in Washington, and appropriated funds to the Duwamish tribe and other treaty tribes. In 1925, we established one of the first tribal constitutions in Washington. In 1957, the Indian Claims Commission recognized the Duwamish tribe as an identifiable tribe of American Indians, finding that we were entitled to a $62,000 judgment for lost ancestral lands comprising present-day Seattle. Department of Interior records between the 1950s and 1970s repeatedly recognized the Duwamish tribe as the signatory to the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott. Up through the 1970s, the only thing that separated the Duwamish from their other tribal neighbors was their lack of a reservation. So how did this history of federal acknowledgement turn into a lack of federal recognition? You see, the federal government maintains a list of federally recognized tribes and has done so for over a century. However, an official procedure for getting on that list wasn't codified by the BIA until 1978. Before then, it was a confusing and not universally applied mix of acts of Congress or executive orders that got one on the list. And it wasn't uncommon for clerical errors to mistakenly remove tribes off the list who had been on there previously. What's more, before 1978, the list was more a list of tribes receiving federal benefits than those that were federally recognized. As the BIA was pretty strict about administering tribal benefits through reservation agencies, this left tribes like the Duwamish without a reservation in a legal gray area. All that is to say, by the 1970s, the Duwamish were nowhere to be found on Uncle Sam's list. Now, there are many things flawed with the process for federal recognition that I'll get into more later in a separate video. But suffice it to say, it's a long, expensive procedure that seems more designed to disenroll as many tribes as possible in a genocide by bureaucracy. Despite these challenges, however, the Duwamish applied for formal federal recognition sometime in the 1970s. I've seen sources alternatively say 1975, 1977, or 1978. In 1979, a ruling was made in the ongoing U.S. v. Washington case that would have major implications for the Duwamish fight for recognition. If you've seen my Fish Wars video, you'll know what I'm talking about. Judge Bolt ruled that the Duwamish did not meet the requirements for federal recognition because of a 10-year break in leadership between 1916 to 1925. One of the requirements is demonstrating continuous political organization since 1900. This was the time immediately after the completion of the Lake Washington Ship Canal and the destruction of the Black River, where many Duwamish had still been living. In the chaos of having to move from their Black River homes and reorganize, a clear public record of their community had been lost. The recognition process took several decades to fulfill, so an official ruling from the BIA did not come down until 1996. But they denied the Duwamish's request on the same grounds as Judge Bolt's 1979 ruling. The Duwamish appealed the decision, piecing together the missing years through genealogical research. They argued that what seemed like a break in organization was simply a transition from one generation of leadership to the next in a continually identifiable Duwamish community. This time they prevailed. On the very last day of the Clinton administration, Cecile Hansen received a call from the BIA saying that the Duwamish had been recognized. Less than a week later, the decision was repealed by the incoming Republican administration of George Bush. The Duwamish were stunned and organized a massive public campaign to appeal the decision. Here's a quote from Coll Thrush about what came next. After a series of inquiries into criminal wrongdoing in the Bureau of Indian Affairs during both the Clinton and Bush administrations, the issue came down to technicalities: when a particular set of papers was signed and whether those papers were drafts or final copies. The decision was reaffirmed again in 2002. Again, the Duwamish appealed and were denied again in 2015 on the same grounds as the original 1996 denial. After President Biden appointed the first Indigenous American Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, in 2021, the Duwamish have once again resumed their appeal. If you want to lend your support to the tribe's fight for recognition, you can visit duwamishtribe.org, link on screen in the description, where you can sign a petition that's being sent to Congress and the Interior Department. The tribe has not let this lack of federal recognition and benefits keep them from being active contributors to their Seattle homes. They continue to be a part of the fabric of the city, as they always have been. Several members are involved in the cleanup of the Duwamish River, which unfortunately is a Superfund site, and in 2009, after buying back their own land, the tribe opened the long-awaited Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center on West Marginal Way at the old town site of Basketry Hat. The Longhouse is open to the public, has a museum, and often hosts events and exhibitions. You can find out more about visiting the Longhouse on the tribe's website. Indigenous people have played and are continuing to play a central role in Seattle's story. They helped the city get off the ground, gave it a unique identity, and provided a model for what respectful intercultural coexistence can look like. Despite 150 years of efforts to exclude them from Seattle society, Indigenous people have continually fought for and asserted their right to a place in this city, and the Duwamish are still here. Seattle's past is a thoroughly Indigenous place, as is its foreseeable future. Thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. That one was really fun for me to make. Again, this video is part of Project Homecoming 2. If you want to check out the rest of the videos in the playlist, I've got a link in the description. There's a bunch of great stuff on there, so I suggest you go check it out. If you like this channel and want to support my work, please do subscribe, like, maybe leave a comment, all that stuff that's good for the algorithm. You can also join my Patreon, link in the description. Thank you again for watching. I will see you next time.